Good morning to all of you, and thank you for coming along to this session. We're here to look at the global consumer power shift and how consumer behaviours are diverging in developed and developing markets. Contemporary events are giving consumers more power, and we're going to look at what this means for brands, using information from Kantar Media's network of TGI studies around the world. Now, time limitations mean that this is a shortened version of what we usually present. If at the end you'd like to see more, please let me know. Among the themes that we're picking up in the data around the world, there's a strong story of overturning the status quo. We see this in a number of ways. There's the societal upheavals. The Arab Spring obviously began a couple of years ago now. Continues in Syria. One wonders whether there will be more. Economic challenges, the EU problems continue. There's resistance to austerity. There's political confusion in certain markets, such as Italy. The technological developments are not going to go backwards again, and they are leading to consumers feeling they have much more power against organisations. And even at the movies, a lot of the big movies of this year or the last 12 months in some way have had this theme of overturning the status quo. The broad economic context is that the world, obviously, we all know, is still in the shadow of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. It's interesting to know, though, that the developing markets, the BRICS in particular, despite this slump, never actually went negative themselves. And they've been the markets that have really driven what recovery there has been subsequently. More specific shifts that we're seeing, a future development is at some point China will overtake the US in terms of GDP. Some forecasts have that as happening as early as 2018. At the same time, Brazil has caught up with the UK and perhaps even passed it now in terms of GDP. And as we all know, there are ongoing stories around multi-billion euro aid packages. So significant shifts still in the global economy. Much of the data we'll examine in this presentation in support of these themes comes from the network of TGI studies that Kantar Media coordinates, as I say. For those unfamiliar with these, they're large-scale studies of consumers' category and brand consumption, their attitudes, and their media behaviours. And we have these available in 70 markets around the world. We're not going to be looking at data from all 70 today. We'll focus mostly on 10, and we've selected these to represent the developed and developing economies in different parts of the world. We've created a global index comparison, which allows us to look at the responses to some of the attitude questions on a comparable basis. This example shows the statement, I think well-known brands are better, and you can see that China, Brazil and Egypt, it's consumers there who are more likely to agree with that than consumers in, well, Germany in particular is the lowest on this one. I should probably trip myself up over the flags at some point in the presentation, so please forgive me if I do that. The full presentation has 3 themes, but in the interests of time today, I've cut out the first section on global shift in generations, save for this one chart which summarises some of the points. We talk about how generational shifts mean that products need to create shared experiences, how higher levels of education mean that marketers need to engage with users on a different basis. Users have a lot more expertise than they used to have. And 18 to 24s is something of a problem audience around the world. And it's interesting to see the cover story on The Economist this week that plays to that. Generation Jobless, the global rise of youth unemployment. Today, though, we're going to focus mainly on the middle class. That's our major theme. Why? Well, it's a very big group, 2 billion people around the world. And the total spending is huge, at 6.9 trillion estimated currently, and it's forecast to triple in the next decade to 20 trillion. So there's huge potential in this group, at least in developing markets. Now, from a TGI point of view, we're going to define them as band 3 in the socioeconomic pyramid that we use. And we'll do that on a consistent basis in all markets. So it's not the top 30%, it's not the bottom 40%, it's the middle 30, if you will. And it's possible to sort of take an average profile, but that doesn't really mean very much. What's more interesting is to look at the variances in the composition of this group between country, and to pick out one, which I've highlighted with a red oval there. Females working full-time averages 31% around the world, but in China it's 68%. That's pretty significant. As it happens, I was in China last week with our TGI partner company CTR, and I've lifted 2 charts from a presentation they gave, which I saw. This one shows per capita GDP over the last 10 years. And this is from the State Statistics Bureau, so it must be correct. The GDP here is shown as going from $1,000 per head in 2003 to $6,100 in 2012. And that's enormous growth. I have to say that I can't really quite square computing that with the stories of 10% compound economic growth that one reads elsewhere, but it is the State Statistics Bureau. The wording that our partners used on this slide is the move from a survival society to an enjoyment society. In other words, this group now, the middle class, has money. 10 years ago, it didn't. Indeed, developing a middle class has been official government policy. This is a quote from Wen Jiabao, who's just stepped down as premier in the recent round of political change. And he says here, we must strive to realize an olive-shaped society in which the middle income earners are the majority. Not the top, not the lower class, but the middle income earners. So an olive-shaped society. I'm kind of surprised they used a rugby ball for the graphic, actually, and why they didn't use an olive, but there you go. Sure enough, this government policy is being played out in TGI data. And we've got a 12-year trend here from 2001 to 2012. The percentage of total expenditure going on food has halved from 33% to 17%. So this is what it means by moving away from a sustenance society. At the same time, car ownership has gone up 7 times from 3 to 21. These are very, very significant shifts and absolutely indicate what's going on in China at the moment. On perhaps a slightly smaller scale, but still very interesting in terms of disposable income purchases. If we look at women's use of cosmetics, this is 2005 to 2012. Again, we see some quite significant increases there in sort of a packaged goods area. In the context of the middle class, we've investigated 3 areas: aspiration and ambition, consumption, finance, and brands. So are they more materialistic? Has their relationship with money changed? And how do they relate to brands? Well, first of all, looking at aspiration, the statement here is money is the best measure of success. So to what extent, or do people middle class in different countries agree with this? It's very clear that relative affluence is a driver here when you look at China and India on one end and US and UK on the other. But it's striking still how this statement is more strongly agreed with in China than in the other developing markets. This chart plots 2 different statements. On the horizontal axis we have willing to sacrifice time with family. On the vertical axis we have want to get at the top of my career. And here we see the middle class in Egypt, China, South Africa and India all saying they're willing to sacrifice family time in pursuit of their ambition. The aspirational element of wanting to set up one's own business, the statement here being, I want to set my own business up one day, quite simply, is seen at its strongest in Mexico. So in all of these developing markets, we are absolutely seeing sort of aspiration driving the middle class. But if we do return to the Chinese middle class, we see that they're career-driven, they're materialistic, they're conflicted about family. They are willing to sacrifice family time, but the family holiday weeks are very big for them, so there are considerable feelings of guilt around all of this. But the focus really there is on working hard and gaining status by showing the material fruits of their labour. We can contrast this with Western Europe and the US, where the difficult economic climate has made people reassess priorities. People seem to be thinking longer term, people in the middle class now. They're certainly more anxious about their future than in the developing markets where we see the aspiration. In the US, though, there is a different story. They are the most ambitious of the social classes in the States, and that may have an interesting impact on the choices that they will make as consumers. We'll move on and look at their attitudes to consumption and finance. Is there a change in middle class attitudes towards money? Well, plastic cards are now used by a significant majority, not only in Western markets, but also in Brazil and China, 76 and 65% there. Credit cards came quite late to China, but debit cards filled the gap. So fairly well penetrated. However, there are some signs of risk-taking in relation to debt in the developing markets. The statement here is, with a credit card I can buy things that I wouldn't normally afford, and you can see, perhaps a little worryingly, 35 to 45% of people in most of the developing markets in the middle class agreeing with this statement. Egypt is the exception. Perhaps that's a cause for concern, perhaps it drives growth. The interesting contrast is with Germany on the left-hand end of that scale. So we can see that Angela Merkel isn't the only German who disapproves of others living beyond their means. Looking more generally, we do detect a squeezed middle class, to answer the question on this chart. In Western markets, this is due to the economic times and the lower levels of buoyancy. But in developing markets, there is this conflict between aspiration and affordability. And the general trend in all cases, actually, is for those differing reasons, greater feelings of guilt in all types of market. And it's over 5 years, we're seeing more people agreeing that they tend to spend without thinking, and fewer saying that they treat themselves to things they don't need. May not be great news for premium brands seeking to target this group. We can cross the claimed readiness to pay for quality, which is on the horizontal scale here, with the desire to get special offers, which is on the vertical scale. Particularly interesting thing here is to note the tension in the Brazil middle class, with the flag on the top right there. The Brazil middle class are certainly positive about well-known brands and about quality and being willing to pay for it, but they're also looking for special offers. So the challenge then for brands is to create an aspirational but affordable positioning. And that's not such a bad mantra for other markets too. With regard to brands then and the middle class, we do, however, see a decline in loyalty. The statement here, if I like a brand, I stick with it. That's on the decrease in Brazil and in Egypt and in China. Even so, relative to the other markets that we've looked at here, Brazil and China are still the most brand loyal. And in keeping with the aspirational tendencies that we've noted, the cosmetics brands that the middle class in China consumes are in many cases quite high end. So what are the implications for brand owners in all of this? How could you think about targeting? Well, reduce guilt. Make it okay to buy non-essentials in developed markets. In developing markets, convince people that they're getting a deal. Try and tackle the work-life balance, soothe the contradiction of having the two priorities, career progress and family, perhaps promote the ability to enhance well-being in this context, and think about happiness. When you're promoting to people, address their aspirations for self-improvement or contentment. A few words on our secondary theme today, which is influences. Again, we'll skip one of the subsections on politics and try and come up with a few observations about influences in the digital and social spheres. We'll start off with a big number, which is 6.9 billion. That's the number of internet users worldwide. It's not actually drawn from TGI, this figure. It comes from internetworldstats.com. What's particularly interesting about this is that there are twice as many internet users now in China as in the US. And it was only actually in 2009 that China overtook the US. And that's only going one way. There's much more growth still to happen in developing markets. Total number of people online in the US, UK, Germany is 80% or thereabouts, so not so much growth is feasible. But there's loads of growth feasible, as we've been hearing all conference in other parts of the world. And digital businesses that operate globally are likely to be looking more and more at developing markets. The world's largest e-commerce company is Alibaba in China. They handle more sales than eBay and Amazon combined. Now, while traditional PC-based internet penetration is low in some markets, India especially, also South Africa and Egypt, mobile phone ownership is over 70%. As yet, smartphone owners are still the minority in most markets, and there's something of a gap between those who have internet access on their mobiles and those who actually make use of it. There's, in some cases, a ratio of only 1 to 3 or 1 to 4. But clearly, this is going to come. There's no doubt about that. And it will put the internet through mobile into the hands of entirely new consumers. There's a recent story in The Economist about Indian fishermen who are barely literate using smartphones while they're out at sea to find out which ports are offering the best prices for the fish they've just caught, and then that's where they head for with their boats on that particular day. As far as social media is concerned, we need to bear in mind that it isn't the same everywhere. Chat rooms are still very big in China and in Germany, for example, and China has its whole own set of rules that the government sets out, alluded to in the box up there. Also, when we look at buzz topics or word of mouth, they vary too. People in different markets are interested in talking to each other about somewhat different things. It's interesting in this context to take the TGI questions on whether consumers ask others for advice or say that other people come to them and map these too by national relativity. Relative to the other markets, if we look in the top right box here, you can see that consumers in Egypt and Brazil like both to give and receive advice, so there's something of a sharing tendency there. In the US, top left, people are likely to check things out, but perhaps more likely to keep them for themselves. GB and Germany more independent. Some might say insular. India, Mexico and China, they like giving advice but tend not to ask other people so much. And this kind of relative understanding could perhaps impact on how digital communication strategies might be developed. Perhaps. Peer-to-peer discussion, brand advocacy, discovery, sharing content and allowing people to make it their own, all legitimate approaches obviously, but each may play better in some markets and with some target populations than others. We can even overlay some online behaviours onto this attitude map. This particular case shows some data from GB, different behaviours, different variables around what people are doing online and what social media sites they're looking at. And it makes sense in how different strategies will work through different means. You have Twitter up more towards the sharing side, LinkedIn down more towards the bottom right with influencers. Seems to make a lot of sense. So as far as the implications of this view on influences is concerned, The mobile internet, we all know it's going to be ubiquitous, really. Is it a solution or is it a toy? Well, it's both, I think. In developing markets, it's a problem solver. So it's important to be aware of that, and I suggest use it as such. In developed markets, and it's perhaps more of an experience or indeed a convenience. In terms of engaging with online chatter, the trick will be to become an authority yet still drive buzz. We've been hearing an awful lot about that at this conference. And if you can develop ways to help people distinguish key information from noise, that can only be a good thing and can contribute to the trust in which your brand will be held. Finally, for 20 years or more, there's been a conundrum or talk in the advertising world about global or local. Well, we can add personal to that now. That's only adds layers of complexity. So through the social media strategies, we have to decide whether we're going to prioritize brand discovery, brand discussion, or what else, and somehow find ways of balancing the global message with individual communication. Now, that probably takes us into the world of addressable advertising. We're making some developments in that area too, but that's a story for another day. So I've drawn all this together from TGI information from around the world. The depth of TGI means that we can be much more specific in the analysis that we do around individual brands and individual media. Please take the booklets with you. If you're interested in talking more, please let me or my colleague Heather know. She's standing at the back there. Or leave your business card with us. In the meanwhile, thank you for your attention.